Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the second day and final day of our debate cycle on One Health in Times of Catastrophe. The discussion we began yesterday invites us to rethink the very meaning of catastrophe in the contemporary world. Today, catastrophe can no longer be understood as isolated, exceptional, or purely natural events. Rather, they must be seen as complex, multidimensional, and often transborder process, shaped by the interaction between environmental degradation, social vulnerability, and global governance failures. In this sense, catastrophes are not only events that disrupt societies, but also phenomena that expose structural inequalities and reveal the limits of existing legal, political, and institutional frameworks. They challenge us to move beyond reactive approach and to develop more anticipatory, coordinate, and integrate response. It's precisely within this context that the One Health approach becomes essential. By recognizing the deep interconnection between human, animal, and environmental health, One Health offers an interdisciplinary framework capable of addressing the complexity of these global risks. As we observed yesterday, it's through the articulation of different fields of knowledge, law, health, sciences, environment studies, and public policy that more coherent and effective response can emerge. We also reflect on how environment harm directly impacts human life, even when its effects are not immediately visible. The discussions on pollution, for example, demonstrate how these impacts extend beyond physical health, affecting mental well-being, and revealing the depth of these often invisible interconnections. At the same time, it became evident that the impacts of this process are not equally distributed. On the contrary, vulnerable or marginalized populations are disproportionately affected, which raises fundamental ethical and legal questions regarding inequity, responsibility, and global justice. As we begin today's section, we will continue to deepen this reflection. We will examine how climate change intensifies health disparities, particularly among marginality population, and how environment degradation contributes to the emergence of zoonotic disease, raising complex questions about prevention, responsibility, and international legal obligations, both before and after catastrophe events. This discussion reinforces the need to rethink how we understand, regulate, and respond to global risks in an increasingly interconnected and vulnerable world. I wish you all a productive and inspiring day of discussion. And as happened yesterday, I'd like to invite my colleague, the lawyer and the member of the Lepadia and the Human Rights Commission of Bar Association, Ms. Milena Salatino, to present and invite our special professor for this day. Please, Miss Milena Salatino.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Okay, perfect now. Thank
Perfect.
you. I was waiting you. The first time I didn't see you in my
Yeah,
cam.
me too. I was trying here.
Welcome
Uh,
again. It's a pleasure to stay with you today. Yesterday was very nice, our first day in meeting, and I have the pleasure to present to you again, as I said, as the member of Commission of Human Rights Bar Association and the research of our group from
yes,
Lepadia.
yes.
So, Milena, it's a pleasure, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Good morning, everyone. And once again, welcome to the sixth debate cycle, One Health in Times of Catastrophe. As Professor Sidney said, my name is Milena Salatino, and I will be once again and for a final time your moderator today. Our first presentation today will be delivered by Professor Maria Célia Ferraz, who is going to talk about the health impacts of climate change on marginalized populations. Then, Professor Tatiana Skeff will present Emerging Zoonoses and International Responsibility for Habitat Damage, a debate on ex ante and ex post catastrophe obligations. Lastly, Professor Sidney will address you for a final time for our closing speeches. With that being said, let's begin our debate cycle. For our first presentation, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Maria Célia Ferraz. She holds a master's degree in law from University Cândido Mendes and is currently pursuing postgraduate studies in philosophy. She's also a professor at Unigaran and a practicing lawyer. Professor Ferraz is actively engaged in research and academic work in human rights and international environmental law as a member of LEPADIA and the Human Rights Observatory. He will address disproportionate health impacts of climate change on marginalized populations. Please, Maria Célia, the floor is yours.
First of all,
Thank,
please, Miss Milena, just
Yes.
to congratulate Professor Maria Célia. It's a pleasure to me to receive you again in our channel. Professor Maria Célia developed an excellent work with us, not only in the Pagia, but also in Human Rights Commission. And I'm very happy to receive you again and to hear in this moment, in this important meeting that's happening in all the parts of the world. So for us, is a big pleasure to receive you. So, Professor Maria Celia.
thank you, guys. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today at the sixth debate cycle promoted by Lepadia and the Human Rights Observatory to discuss an issue that is urgent, complex, and deeply rooted in questions of justice: the disproportionate health impacts of climate change on marginalized populations in Brazil. Climate change is often framed as an environmental or scientific problem, but in reality, it's a social and political phenomenon, one that exposes and intensifies historical inequalities. It's not a neutral phenomenon. Its health impacts are distributed unevenly across populations. Today, I want to explore how these inequities manifest, why they persist, and how a One Health approach can guide us toward more just and resilient health systems. First, I question myself why this topic matters. Why are we here discussing it? Climate change affects everyone, but not equally. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, food insecurity, disease outbreaks do not occur in a vacuum. They intersect with race, class, gender, and geography. In Brazil, these intersections are particularly stark. Historically marginalized populations face disproportionate risks. Environmental racism highlights how structural inequalities shape patterns of exposure and adaptive capacity. This means that climate change does not create new inequalities, but it magnifies the ones we already have. And who are the marginalized populations? Brazil is a country marked by extraordinary cultural diversity, but also by profound social inequality. And when we talk about climate change, these inequalities become even more visible. Not everyone is exposed to climate risks in the same way, and not everyone has the same capacity to respond, to adapt, or to recover. Let me walk you through the groups who are most affected. Indigenous people live in territories that are deeply connected to ecosystems, forests, rivers, and biodiversity. Climate change threatens not only their physical health, but also their cultural survival. Droughts, forest fires, and the loss of traditional food sources disrupt centuries old ways of life. Many communities face increasing pressure from deforestation, illegal mining, and land conflicts, which further weaken their resilience. Quilombola territories are often located in environmentally fragile areas, historically neglected by public policy. These communities face recurrent flooding, soil degradation, and limited access to clean water. Their struggles are rooted in centuries of racial exclusion, which continue to shape their exposure to climate hazard today. Also, Afro-descendant, and here specifically women, they experience the intersection of racism, sexism, and economic inequality. Afro-descendant and indigenous women face multiple barriers to accessing healthy food, education, employment, and political participation. These barriers mean that climate impacts such as food insecurity, heat stress, and disease outbreaks fall more heavily on their shoulders. They are often responsible for caregiving, household food provision, and community leadership. Yet, they have the least access to resources. Riverine communities and families living near flood prone areas are among the first to feel the effects of extreme rainfall. They lose homes, belongings, and livelihood in a matter of hours. Repeated displacement creates cycles of trauma, economic instability, and long term health consequences. But not only this, in Brazil's major cities, climate vulnerability is shaped by urban inequality. Peripheral neighborhoods often lack drainage, sanitation, green spaces, and safe housing. Heat waves become more intense due to the urban heat island effect. Landslides and floodings are common, and access to emergency services is limited. These communities are living at a front line of climate injustice. Let, Last but not least, the farmers, the extractivists, the communities, the rural communities in Brazil, the rural workers, they depend directly on rainfall, soil quality, and biodiversity. Droughts, crop failures, and water scarcity threaten food security and economic stability. Many of these people are forced to migrate or take on precarious work, increasing their vulnerability. These populations are not inherently vulnerable. They are made vulnerable by structural conditions, by the way society distributes resources, opportunities, and risks. These people face limited access to healthcare, barriers to political participation, food insecurity, poor infrastructure, exposure to environmental hazards, and systemic discriminations. These are not isolated issues, they are interconnected forms of exclusion that shape how climate impacts are experienced. And this is crucial. Climate change does not create inequality, it amplifies it, as we have been saying. It determines who has the means to protect themselves, who has the ability to rebuild, and ultimately, who has the possibility to survive. These barriers shape not only how climate change impacts are felt by communities, but also who is able to recover, who is going to be left behind, and whose lives matter, whose lives are considered expendable in the face of environmental crisis. Now that we have identified who are the most affected groups, I want to move into the heart of this discussion. How climate change disproportionately impact these populations. Because the inequalities we see are not abstract, they translate into very concrete, very tangible health consequences. I'll walk you through five major pathways through which climate change deepens existing vulnerabilities. The very first one is the extreme weather events. Across Brazil, extreme weather events are becoming more frequent, more intense, and more unpredictable, but their impacts are not evenly distributed. Let's start with riverine communities. When floods hit, these families often lose everything: their homes, their crops, their fishing equipment, their documents, their livelihood. Recovery is slow and, in many cases, impossible. These communities live in areas where public infrastructure is weak, where early warning systems are limited, and where emergency response takes too long to arrive. In urban peripheries, heavy rains trigger landslides, destroy houses built on unstable slopes, and collapse drainage systems that were never designed to withstand this level of climate stress. These neighborhoods are the result of decades of unequal urban planning, where low income families were pushed into high risk areas. And in rural indigenous and quilombola territories, drought and water scarcity threaten food production, traditional agriculture, and access to clean water. When rivers dry up, when soil becomes infertile, it's not just an economic loss, it's a cultural and spiritual rupture. These events deepen poverty, increase disease risk, and create cycles of vulnerability that are passed from one generation to the other. Number two is the food insecurity. Climate change is reshaping food systems in ways that hit marginalized populations the hardest. Droughts reduce crop yields. Soil degradation limits agricultural productivity, and biodiversity loss affects traditional food sources. When food becomes scarce or expensive, it's the poorest families, especially women, who feel the impact first. As we have said, climate change intensifies pre existing inequalities, creating cumulative disadvantages for populations already excluded from social, economic, and political structures. This is especially true for Afro descendant and indigenous women, who often, as we said, carry the responsibility of feeding the families while having the least access to land, income, and political voice. Food insecurity leads to malnutrition, anemia, stunting in children, and long term chronic diseases. It also reduces resilience because a population that is undernourished is less able to cope with climate shocks. The third is the infectious diseases and environmental degradation. Climate change also alters the ecology of infectious diseases. High temperatures and irregular rainfall expand the habitats of mosquitoes, increasing cases of dengue, malaria, chikungunya, and Zika. Floods contaminate water sources, leading to outbreaks of leptospirosis, diarrheal diseases, and hepatitis A. And stagnant water in poorly served neighborhoods become a breeding ground for vectors. Communities with poor sanitation, limited access to healthcare, especially and often the Black, Indigenous, and peripheral, they face the highest burden. These are the same communities where sewage systems are incomplete, where garbage collection is irregular, and where environmental degradation is already a daily reality. Climate change, again, doesn't create these problems but magnifies them. The fourth, mental health impacts. We often talk about the physical impacts of climate change, but psychological impacts are just as profound. Climate anxiety, uncertainty about the future, the trauma of repeated disasters affect mental well being. Displacement, whether temporary or permanent, disrupts social networks, livelihoods, and identity. For indigenous people, the loss of land is especially devastating. Land is not just a physical space, it's memory, ancestry, spirituality, and community. When climate change threatens rivers, forests, sacred sites, it threatens the very foundations of indigenous identity. And mental health services, however, are scarce in the regions most affected, which means that trauma accumulates and often silently. Finally, the fifth one, barriers to healthcare access. Climate change exacerbates existing barriers to healthcare, and these barriers are deeply rooted in environmental racism. Marginalized populations often rely on underfunded health systems with limited staff, outdated equipment, and fragile infrastructures. Many communities must travel long distance to reach a clinic, often without reliable transportation. Even when they arrive, they might face lack of culturally appropriate care, language barriers, discrimination, long waiting times, and shortage of essential medicines. These groups are more exposed to extreme weather events, food insecurity, disease outbreaks, while simultaneously have limited access to healthcare resources, political participation. This combination, high exposure to low access, is what makes climate change so devastating for marginalized populations. So when we talk about climate change, we're not just talking about rising temperature, changing rainfall patterns. We are also talking about who gets sick first, who suffers the most, who is left behind. These impacts are not random. They follow the lines of inequality that have shaped Brazil for centuries. And this brings us the next crucial question. Why do these inequities exist in the first place? What are the structural forces that make some populations so much more vulnerable than others? That's what we'll explore now. Environmental racism is structural. It's embedded in the way Brazil was built, in the way land was distributed, in the way cities were planned, in the way public policies continue to operate today. It begins with colonial land dispossession when indigenous people were violently removed from their territories and enslaved Africans were forced to a label without rights or land. This history shapes the geography of vulnerability we see today. It continues through racial segregation, both explicit and implicit. Black and indigenous communities were pushed into environmentally fragile areas, floodplains, steep hillsides, polluted riverbanks, places that were never meant to be safe or healthy. We see it in unequal urban planning, where wealthy neighborhoods receive infrastructure, sanitation, green spaces, climate resilient design, but peripheral communities are left with precarious housing, chronic exposure to hazards. We see it in the underinvestment in Black and Indigenous territories, where health services are scarce, roads are unpaved, basic sanitation is still a distant promise. We see it in political exclusion, where the voices of marginalized groups are systematically ignored in decision making spaces, including climate adaptation planning. And we see it in economic marginalization too, where limited access to jobs, credit, land ownerships reduce the capacity to adapt and recover from climate shocks. These structures determine who lives near polluted rivers, who lacks sanitation, who faces food deserts, and who is left out of climate adaptation policies. This unequal burden reflects environmental racism, where historical and systemic exclusion shapes patterns of vulnerability and adaptive capacity. In other words, climate change did not create injustice, it just reveals it. Given the complex landscape, we need a framework capable of addressing the interconnected nature of these challenges. And this is where the One Health approach becomes essential. One Health recognizes that human health is inseparable from the health of animals, ecosystems, and the environment. It tells us that we cannot treat disease outbreaks, food insecurity, or environmental degradation as isolated problems, because they are not. A One Health approach requires several key strategies. Integrated surveillance. We need systems that monitor climate sensitive disease across humans, animals, and ecosystems. Dengue, malaria, leptospirosis, zoonotic spillovers, all of these are shaped by environmental change. Integrated surveillance allows to detect risks earlier and respond more effectively. Also, community-driven adaptation. Communities are not passive victims, they are knowledge holders. Communities adapt must be built together, including them, not being imposed on them. This is especially true for indigenous and Quilombola peoples, whose traditional knowledge is essential for environmental stewardship. Also, equity-focused policies. Climate adaptation must explicitly address race, gender, and class. If policies do not confront inequality, they will reproduce it. This means designing programs that prioritize the most affected populations, allocate resources fairly, and ensure representation in decision making. And finally, is strengthening health systems. We need resilient health systems that are capable of responding to climate related challenges, what includes training health workers, improving financing, strengthening intersectoral coordination, and ensuring culturally competent care. A health system that does not understand the realities of marginalized populations can never protect them. One Health is not just a technical framework, it's a justice framework. It reminds us that protecting environment is protecting people. Equity must be at the center of climate health strategies. This research identifies several critical gaps that must be addressed if we want to build climate resilient health systems that are legitimate and effective. The first is lack of equity in national adaptation plans. What we see is that climate policies often overlook race, gender, and class, failing to prioritize those who are the most at risk. Also, there is insufficient financing. Without adequate resources, adaptation remains symbolic rather than transformative. The third, we see weak intersectoral coordination. Health, environment, housing, agriculture, social protection must work together. Climate change does not respect bureaucratic boundaries. And fourth, there is limited participation of marginalized groups. Communities must be included, not only beneficiaries, but decision makers. And finally, there is an absence, as I previously said, of a race gender sensitive indicator. What we do not measure, we cannot change. Addressing this gap is not optional, but essential. Because a climate resilient health system must also be equitable system of health. And equity is not an add-on, it's the very foundation of resilience. Climate change, as I have been saying, is not an environmental crisis, but it's a justice crisis. If we want resilience, we must confront inequality. If we want effective adaptation, we must center the voices of those most affected. And if we want a healthier future, we must embrace the One Health vision, one that understands humans as well being is inseparable from land, water, animals, and communities that sustain us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Maria
much.
Celia.
Thank you very much, Professor Maria Celia. It was a pleasure to hear you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Celia, so much. Just a brief comment. One point that I thought was really interesting in your presentation was on the topic of environmental racism, which I don't think, at least, I think it's not as widely discussed as it should be. And it highlights how the environmental risks and harms are not actually distributed equally, but rather disproportionately affects the marginalized communities, as you said. And also, especially when talking about Brazil, how it stems from our colony days, and it's also brought until the until today by public policies who are still, right, producing this disproportion. So I thought that was really interesting what you brought to now.
Eliana, I think that your internet's not going well. Try to return, please. Let's go. Okay, Milena, let's try again. Yeah, I think in this moment it's okay. Please go ahead, Milena.
Okay. Sorry, I'm having some internet issues today. Okay. So once again, thank you so much, Maria Celia. Now it's we're gonna take a turn to our next speaker, who is Professor Tatiana Skeff. Can we call the professor, please? Hello, Professor Tatiana. Welcome. Professor Tatiana is an associate professor of international environmental and consumer law at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul here in Brazil. She also teaches in graduate programs in international relations and energy studies. She holds a PhD in international law from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, has vast international experience. She studied in Canada also. And Professor Scaff also serves as a Brazilian expert appointed by the Ministry of Justice to collaborate with the Hague Conference on Private International Law. She will present Emerging Zoonoses and International Responsibility for Habitat Damage, a debate on ex ante and ex post catastrophe obligations. The floor is yours, Professor.
Just a minute, please, Milena. I'd like only to say hi to Professor Tatiana Scaff. She's a big friend that we have, and we have the opportunity to make some congress here in Brazil and outside in other countries. For example, in Romania, German, Croatia, and Portugal, Spain. So I like so much Professor Tatiana. She's a big expert in this subject about international environmental law. And for me, it's a pleasure to receive again Professor Tatiana in our channel and in this moment, in this important congress that is happening in all the world. So, as you know, One Health Summit um, is developed these initiatives to a lot of center of research. So in this moment, it's happening here in Brazil, in Australia, in USA, in Canada, in Japan, so everywhere. So for us, it's a pleasure to receive you, Professor Maria Celia, and the other guys that speak yesterday. And I invited you, Professor Tatiana Scaffi and Professor Maria Celia, that she stay with us here in background, listen this meeting, and to send us your contributed an article because I intend to make a publication about this. So thank you so much. For us, it's a big pleasure, and you are always welcome to stay with us here and in Rio de Janeiro too. So please, and Milena conduct this meeting with you. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor
Thank you,
Sidney.
Professor. Uh, you may take the stage.
Perfectly. Thank you, Professor Sidney. Thank you, Milena, for having me here at this important conference. It is a pleasure to address such an important issue as One Health, and always having to share the floor with Professor Maria Celia is also a pleasure for me. So, the main idea of my talk today is to discuss a little bit on the international responsibilities for zoonoses in terms of ex post and ex ante obligations that states have in order to fight the possibility of having other catastrophes as pandemics or even other cases such as zoonoses. Therefore, I must start by saying that, according to Professor Sidney Guerra, catastrophe law is an emergency transdisciplinary legal branch designed to provide normative responses to extreme events that cause severe damage to human and animal life, the economy, and the environment itself. Professor Guerra proposes that this field should not be viewed merely as a collection of emergency rules, but as a structured system for managing human vulnerability and risks. Catastrophe law, thus, has three central pillars. The first one is the recognition that it is a transdisciplinary field involving administrative, criminal, environmental, international law, and by all means, human rights. But not only that, it is also a transnational field because it encompasses situations that not only start and end in one country, but has a possibility of being transboundary, therefore causing certain effects in other countries, even though it started in one state different from the others. The second pillar catastrophe law involves is the recognition of the role of the state in informing people and other branches of society, such as the private sector and the international community as a whole. The information is a principle of international law that has been established long ago, for instance, in 1949 in the Corfu Channel decision involving two states. But we certainly have this information principle being expanded to the relations among state and its individuals, being them private or personal people. But we also have a third pillar under catastrophe law, which is the recognition that the disaster cycle has many phases, such as the prevention and mitigation, preparation, response and recovery, reconstruction, and we shall add responsibility. International responsibility precisely is a necessary addition when it comes to fighting the anthropogenic causes of many catastrophes, which can be climate change or even the impact of man towards the environment, such as having the COVID-19 pandemic a couple of years ago. After all, as Professor Guerra says, the increasing frequency and intensity of such events, either extreme weather ones or endemic and pandemic ones, require an update of the legal system, which was historically designed for stability rather than a permanent state of exception imposed by such disasters. And finding those responsible of such situations is imperative for the state to properly adapt its practices from a more traditional view of law, which is its repressive characteristic. That is, in the event of a violation, the responsible party shall be punished, as alluded to in Kelsen's Spear Theory of Law work. But what are the requirements for the international responsibility of states? Normally, there needs to be a violation of international law and a causal link with the perpetrator. Damage, being it moral or even material, is not necessarily required for state responsibility to exist. In this respect, the existence of a robust ex ante rules are imperative because without them, it is not possible for state conduct to be assessed as unlawful and therefore give rise to state responsibility and reparations ex post facto. Within this scope, rules that can be said to be under the chapeau of international disaster law has evolved in quite a robust manner. And here I will bring 4 topics that have been lately addressed in this issue. The first example is the World Health Organization Pandemic Agreement, adopted on May 20th, 2025. It is a legally binding international instrument designed to strengthen global prevention, preparedness, and response to future pandemics. It focuses on equity, pathogen access and benefit sharing, the PABS system, and strengthening health system, particularly for low and middle income countries, while respecting their national sovereignty. Its purpose specifically is to prevent a repeat of the inequities since during COVID-19, ensuring faster, equitable access to vaccines, diagnosis, and treatments. Its key pillars are to establish a pathogen access and benefit sharing system for rapid sharing of pathogens and benefits, such as vaccines and treatments. Its scope includes the strengthening of diseases surveillance, creating a global supply chain and logistics network, and boosting local production capacities, especially in developing countries. However, we have to say that the status of this agreement is not yet in force. The agreement was indeed adopted by the 78th World Health Assembly, but it will only enter into force after at least 60 WHO member countries ratify it. But in accordance to Article 31 of the agreement itself, it shall be open for signature by member states only after the World Health Assembly adopts an annex based on pathogen access and benefit sharing systems. And the World Health Organization has not yet finalized such an access. An access concerning the PABS system is intended, after all, to ensure an equal footing on rapid sharing of pathogens and with pandemic potential, and a fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising for their use, including vaccines, diagnosis, and therapeutics, as I mentioned. And as of March 2026, is still being negotiated at the Geneva headquarters, World Health Organization headquarters. Well, if such WHO pandemic agreement is still not yet in force, but it would be under the chapeau of international disaster law in terms of an ex ante measure, we have to talk about other possibilities. Another example in control is the control of zoonoses. Zoonoses are infectious diseases that naturally transmit between vertebrate animals and humans, caused by either bacteria, viruses, parasites, or fungi. They're responsible for over 60% of known human infection diseases and 75% of new ones. They can spread through direct contact, food, water, and vectors such like as mosquitoes and ticks. Zoonosis control at the international level is primarily addressed through the One Health approach, which integrates human, animal, and environmental health and has been promoted by global organizations following the rise of pandemics, such as the COVID-19. A parenthesis, One Health is an integrated, unifying approach that aims to a sustainable balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems, recognizing that the health of humans, domestic and wild animal plants, and wider environment, including here the ecosystem itself, are closely linked and interdependent. While health, food, water, energy, and environment are all wider topics with sector-specific concerns, and collaboration across sectors and disciplines contribute to protect health, address health challenges such as the emergence of infectious diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and food safety, promoting the health integrity of our ecosystem. It links human, animals, and the environment, being a possibility to help addressing the full spectrum of disease control, from prevention to detection and even response and management, which are important for global health security. In terms of international law governing control of zoonoses focuses on monitoring, surveillance, and trade relations, as per the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species, the CITES Convention. It is an agreement that manages wildlife trade, particularly by regulating the movement of species, reducing risks associated with trafficking and zoonotic transmission. After all the illicit wildlife trade creates substantial disease risks by bypassing veterinary controls, requiring a more robust enforcement of international law. It is not only prescribed under the CITES agreement, but also in regional agreements too, such as the EU Animal Health Law Regulation number 429 of 2016, which sets strict rules for preventing and controlling transmissible animal diseases within the European Union, emphasizing surveillance and biosecurity. Not only that, the European Union Directive 99 of 2003 on foodborne zoonosis also takes an important role in monitoring foodborne zoonotic agents like salmonella and salmonella-related antimicrobial resistance. Other organizations can also come into play when it comes to regulating this zoonosis when it comes to international law, such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Organization of Animal Health, and the United Nations Environmental Program. An example, although in terms of soft law, is the Tripartite Zoonosis Guide, the TZG, developed to provide guidance on sectorial coordination, surveillance, and informational sharing. Moving on to the third possibility of regulation under international law, under the International Disaster Framework, exists under the WTO, the World Trade Organization, as the management of zoonosis risks in international trade can also be made through the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures Agreement, the SPS Agreement, which ensures that measures directed to protect human and animal health are scientifically based and not disguised trade barriers. In the context of disaster law or sudden health crisis like pandemics, the SPS agreement provides a legal framework for governments to adopt emergency measures provided they are scientifically justified and thus transparent. The SPS agreement, per se, provides a framework to balance the protection of human health and plant life, which are need to prevent unjustified trade barriers, particularly concerning diseases that can jump from animals to humans. It permits member states to restrict trade to protect against zoonotic risks from animals, animal products, and wildlife. Measures should be applied only to the extent of necessary contention of risks and not an ongoing situation. Should it not discriminate between countries where similar conditions prevail? The SPS measures must be based on scientific principles, normally taking into consideration the World Organization of Animal Health, as it is recognized as the reference organization for animal health and zoonosis, providing standards in a terrestrial and aquatic animal health codes. Therefore, what member states should do is that they must notify the WTO of new sanitary legislation or changes in health regulations, ensuring transparency. The WTO SPS Committee also provides a forum for discussing trade measures related to zoonosis. This is quite important as zoonosis disease control has become a major topic of discussion, with around 35% of all trade concerns raised under the SPS Committee relating to animal diseases and zoonoses themselves. But not only those kind of agreements should be taken into consideration. That is, not only the not into force WHO pandemic agreement or the CITES or SPS agreements, but we have to take into consideration international environmental law principles as another form of ex-ante measures of a generic scope that are also present under international law to prevent violation of international law by states when it comes to fighting, therefore, pandemics or even climate emergencies. We are talking about specifically the precautionary and preventive principles. Precautionary principle that has been used by the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, preventive principle that has been used by the International Court of Justice, and both that have been mentioned by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in various decisions. These principles are very important because they advance the possibility of having, of course, states liable for either pandemic or zoonosis, in terms of not carrying out measures such as, for instance, an environmental impact assessment, or even by not regulated within the national or domestic scope rules that are intended to protect the state itself from contributing to the emergence of zoonosis or other forms of pandemics. In this in this vein, therefore, we can talk about that ex ante stage is quite advanced under international disaster law, because there are various forms of rules that create this basic scope that states must follow. But we also have to talk about an ex post action that should be taken into consideration, precisely the issue of international responsibility that must be addressed as well in terms of fighting zoonosis and adopting a One Health approach. We do not have cases involving the international liability of countries for pandemics and zoonoses yet, but the possibility of this liability exists. And it is what makes this point so relevant, particularly in terms of restitution and compensation and guarantees of non-repetition, which are the forms of reparations under international law when damages are present. But not only that, satisfaction when no damage is found under international law. We have to talk about the possibility of having a state responsible and having it to pay compensation to another if such scenarios of disaster happen. Not only that, they must be also held possibly responsible of turning the situation back on the point that it was before this disaster scenario happens. Therefore, making restitution a possibility. But also we have to take into consideration the guarantees of non-repetition, which are particularly present under the Inter-American System of Human Rights and have been addressed either in the advisory opinion number 17 of 2023, but also in the advisory opinion 32 of 2025. Not only that, we have to talk about satisfaction, which is very much common within the International Court of Justice framework when it comes to environmental reparation. Without these ex post possibilities, we cannot force states to take all the ex ante measures that exist under international law. Without the ex post factor, let's say, we will have states that are not taking part into these ex ante measures, either, for instance, becoming part of the WHO pandemic agreement, or even adopting the soft law created by the Food and Agriculture Organization, World Health Organization, World Organization of Animal Health, and the United Nations Environmental Program. So it must be addressed as well, not only taking into consideration the creation of these ex ante measures, but also finding states responsible is an important step for having states to adopt such measures before a pandemic or before a disaster in terms of weather events taking to place. By all means, the WTO would have another possibility under the SPS agreement, which could find states responsible for not taking the preventive measures that it prescribes when it comes to fighting emergency situations. Nevertheless, we have to mention that the WTO now it's under fire by the United States and has been paralyzed when it comes to its form of having states held responsible. Therefore, its court is not under it's not acting upon the possibility of having states responsible, which means that although it is a quite important structure under international law, it's not being effective currently in terms of addressing such possibilities of ex post facto responsibility. Nevertheless, we have to take into consideration that such a zoonosis and such a scenario should be addressed under this international catastrophe law. Including these patterns are important in order to find states responsible, and also on battling the possibilities of having not only humans but also animals and the environment per se violated because these actions have not been taken into consideration by states in their international relations. So I would like to finalize with this final message. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I would love to hear more comments or even discussing a little bit more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Sidney, I can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very
Now,
much,
yes.
Professor Tatiana Scaff, for your presentation. Milena, would you like to make an point for your exposition?
Yes, yes. What you said that I thought was really interesting and that stuck with me was regarding the ex post responsibility, that actually there hasn't been any international responsibility applied to any state um, until now for pandemics or zoonosis, from what I could grasp. And that also the ex ante responses are actually not as effective without the ex post response. So we need, I think, from what I could grasp that you said, that we need this ex post response so that we can think ahead and also promote prevention and make states promote these preventive measures, right?
Indeed, Milena, what we think or what I think about this scenario currently is that we do have a robust normative structure that has been built lately under the framework of catastrophe law or international disaster law, which encompasses many areas, not only World Health Organization, but also the WTO and even general principles of environmental international law, such as precaution and prevention. But nevertheless, we have this structure, but it hasn't been applied. But the problem is that it could, right? And of course, here we have a difference between law and politics. Sometimes the states can take steps into finding other states responsible for either environmental disasters or zoonosis itself, but they choose not to act. But the possibility of acting would be imperative in this case, because without taking into consideration the health spirit theory of law, that law is also repressive. We should have the possibility of finding states responsible, but the problem is that the main framework that we would have for having a state responsible today would be the WTO, but the WTO is finding problems when it comes to having states held responsible because of the United States not nominating judges for its panels. Therefore, what we see is that in terms of finding states responsible, we would have states being held responsible only for preventive and precautionary principles not being taken into consideration, not for specific rules. So we have to take both parts into consideration when it comes to addressing these One Health issues currently, right?
Yes, yes, certainly. Thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation. It gave us a lot to think about. Once again, also the other presenters, I think we can extract from these 2 days of debates that we have a lot to think about and still a lot to work on and research in order to take this One Health approach one step ahead. Now, before passing the baton to Professor Sidney for closing statements, I would like to thank everyone once again for your presence with us here today online, and also to those of you who watched us yesterday. Of course, Professor Sidney for the invitation, uh, and Professor Maria Celia and Professor Skeff for their presentations today. I wish everyone a good rest of your day. Professor Sidney, please, for the closing statements.
Thank you very much again, Milena and Professor Tatiana Skeff. I'd like to invite Professor Maria Celia to stay with us to close our meeting. Yeah, everybody together, as we have the opportunity to stay together in Croatia. It was very funny. And soon we'll be in Ireland too, again. So it's very good to us to make this work together. So thank you so much, Maria Celia and Tatiana Skeff. Well, as we come to the end of this debate cycle, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all speakers and participants who contributed to the success of this event. Over these 2 days, we have seen that the challenges we face, from environmental degradation to global health risks, are deeply interconnected and require integrated and interdisciplinary responses. The One Health approach has proven to be not only relevant, but essential in guiding how we understand and address these issues. Our discussions have also highlighted the urgency of confronting inequities, particularly in relation to vulnerable population, and the need to strengthen both national and international frameworks capable of responding to complex global risks. More importantly, this event has shown that knowledge alone is not enough. What is required is continued dialogue, cooperation, and a shared commitment to building more just, sustainable, and effective solutions. I hope that the reflection we have shared here will extend beyond this space and inspire further research, policy development, and collective action. So I'm very happy and grateful to Maria Célia, to Tatiana Skeff, to Milena Saladino, to Cássio Chay, to Gabriel Pinho, to Luana Costa, and Tiziana Sampaio that spend your precious time to present research and the opportunity that we mind more and more about this problem that we have in our world. So thank you very much for all. Have a great rest of your day. And in this point, have Easter. We cannot forget this moment, this day, in the first time we think to make this presentation together in the room of United States, Professor Tatiana Skeff, but today's closed here in Rio de Janeiro because we have this period to reflection for everybody has to think about what we are doing in our life, what we are doing for beauty, better world. So thank you so much And I invite all to make a picture. Please, Sabrina, that she's giving all the support. And thank you so much, Sabrina, for all. You are very special for us too. And when you take a picture, Milena, please stay with us. Yes, to take a picture, and then we can finish. And we hope we stay very soon together here in our channel and in our Congress in Brazil or outside Brazil. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. I was taking a picture. I don't know if Sabrina, um, her internet's unstable too today, but I'll try and take a picture here.
Okay. And then we can